Afternoon. Welcome to the Women's Fund's Pay Transparency Research Release. Thank you for being here. My name is Alicia Miller, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Fund. And I'll just talk a little bit about who we are and what we do before we get started. Here we have an agenda for you. So we have the research overview, but we also have a case study and an interview with an HR consultant that we're really excited about today. So the Women's Fund's mission is to advance gender and racial equity for women by addressing systemic barriers to upward mobility. So here's our vision on the left. We are designing a community where all women can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We'll do so through our success equation, which you can see on the right side of the screen. So we start off with research. Everything we do is grounded in research. It is fundamental to our decisions and priorities. So that is our first step, assessing the status and identifying opportunities through research. Next, we catalyze the community by producing compelling messaging and tools for multiple stakeholders to own and address the issues, building a common agenda with key partners and inspiring the public to support and promote our work. We will then drive systemic change by spurring leaders to take action within their spheres of influence to initiate transformation of inequitable systems. Through doing so, we will see improved conditions for women to achieve self-sufficiency in the Greater Cincinnati region. So we lead by providing a strong voice for women in our community. We bring together decision makers from different sectors so we can solve big community problems faster. The Women's Fund has issued groundbreaking studies on the status of women and girls in our community. And this research helps us clarify the challenges, educate our leaders, and gives us a roadmap of what issues to tackle first. Based on our research in pay equity and the wage gap, we decided to take a deeper look into pay transparency. Today, we'll be focusing on the release of our new research paper, Pay Transparency Measures in the United States. I will turn it over to Dr. Sally Lloyd, our research committee chair, to tell you more about why we chose to research this topic more deeply and talk about what we found.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. As Alicia mentioned, my name is Travis Spies. I'm the Applied Research Director at the Women's Fund. And today we'd like to spend some time reviewing our latest research report, Pay Transparency Measures in the United States. So since 2017, gender and racial pay equity and wage gaps have been one of our key priority areas at the Women's Fund. We've researched the issue and potential solutions from many angles, including considering employer and government interventions. In recent years, there's been a growing national movement recognizing pay transparency as one strategic solution to address these disparities. We developed this report to more thoroughly understand the impacts and arguments for and against pay transparency policies. Whether you're an employer, policymaker, community leader, or wage earner, we hope that this information will provide a more complete picture of the impact of pay transparency, as well as provide actionable methods to increase transparency within your own spheres of influence. Pay transparency is a broad term that describes the level of openness about wages, salaries, and compensation of other employees or job openings. It ranges along a continuum from open pay, where employee names and pay levels are publicly available, to total secrecy. There are many options that lie in between. For example, publishing pay bands for different job classifications, providing pay ranges to job applicants, and publishing salary information with gender and race breakdowns. William Heisler, professor of human resource management at Troy University, provides an excellent framework for thinking about transparency along a continuum from low to high transparency along multiple dimensions of wages and salaries. This abbreviated chart here highlights some of the ways that the various policies can be considered as existing on this continuum, ranging from little or no transparency to high degrees of transparency. And one important thing to note about this framework is that there are different dimensions of pay transparency with different levels of transparency within those dimensions. So almost all organizations have some level of pay transparency. A complete absence of pay transparency is quite uncommon. For organizations seeking to make the process of pay more transparent, you can consider how these multiple dimensions offer different opportunities for kind of shifting the needle towards more transparent policies, like telling employees how pay is determined, for example. Pay transparency is affected by legal mandates, explicit employer policies, and informal norms about the disclosure of salary and compensation information. Typically, the salaries of public sector employees, executives in publicly traded corporations, and unionized employees are required to be made public. As a result, in these sectors, pay transparency is high, whereas in the private sector, it is low. Currently, social and cultural influences are fostering a shift in attitudes about pay confidentiality, and the desire for pay transparency is high. In a recent survey, 79% of employees would like some transparency. Oops, I went to the wrong side. 79% of employees would like some transparency, and 32% desired total transparency. In fact, job applicants rate information about salary and compensation as the top information that is desired in job postings. More than half of workers would consider moving to a company that provides higher pay transparency, and among younger workers, this percentage goes up to 70%. Gen Z and millennials in particular view pay secrecy practices as antiquated and see discussions about compensation as one way to support their career growth. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Sally Lloyd, Chair of the Women's Fund Research Committee.
Thank you. First, I'm going to talk about what are the arguments in favor of pay transparency, and then the arguments in favor of pay confidentiality. What we find is that people tend to have very passionate views about pay transparency and pay confidentiality. Those who favor transparency emphasize that transparency can help reduce favoritism, it can help reduce discrimination, it can keep the focus on productivity as the determinant of pay, not who a manager likes the best. It can really work to help ensure that merit goes to those who work hardest rather than those who bargain the hardest. Pay transparency can lead to increased accountability. It will help to expose wage inequalities and inequities. A company can no longer say, I didn't know that we had inequities. It can also enhance a company's reputation, which might be really important in today's tight labor market in order to attract top talent, and in particular, the younger generation. Having transparency around pay is important. And ultimately, the hope is that pay transparency will lead to lower gender and racial wage gaps, that it will increase wage equity. So what are the arguments in favor of pay confidentiality? Again, people feel passionately, for example, that pay confidentiality avoids internal conflict among employees. It can help avoid envy and resentment. Managers may believe that they can more easily reward productivity when they give out their bonuses and salary increases, if that's done privately. Companies might believe that it helps them retain their talent. Another company can't come along and steal your top talent if they don't know what that top talent is being paid. There are also fears about administrative burden and fears of unintended consequences, such as ending up causing salary compression, such that everybody ends up being paid relatively the same. More important than these arguments, however, is what does the research show us? What do we actually know about the specific impacts of pay transparency on employees, on employers, and on communities? Fortunately, there are a number of states, local governments, organizations, corporations, and even whole countries that have put into place pay transparency policies over the past 10 years. And these enactments help us to have what's called a natural field study of what actually happens when pay transparency is put into place. So let's start with business impact. We do see an overall increase in employee productivity, in job satisfaction, in trust in management, and in perceived fairness of the company. When an employee understands why a pay difference exists, we see higher performance in that organization. So there's motivation there. Studies also show that pay transparency can help employers reach their pay transparency goals. Their pay equity goals. That if you are making things transparent, then you've also made a commitment to the community to really address any inequities. Let's move on to the compensation system. How is that impacted by pay transparency? The first thing is that pay transparency encourages managers to develop more observable metrics in determining pay. Managers have to be very clear and have to be able to articulate how and for what people are compensated using clear criteria. It also encourages managers to aggressively address wage inequities. Once again, wage inequities become apparent to everyone, and so managers have to start to really thinking about it. Now, it should be noted that there are two different things that might happen when you alter your compensation criteria, when you put a new program into place under pay transparency. In some cases, pay transparency can lead to salary compression, and we do see that in some of the studies. This happens when managers respond to new transparency rules by actually just rewarding employees fairly equally. That leads to salary compression. On the other hand, if managers help to create a new compensation system that clarifies how salaries are allocated and how your performance compares to coworkers in the same band, then we can avoid salary compression. So refreshing the compensation system can actually be very positive. What about organizational climate? There is a lot of research that supports that pay transparency does have an impact on organizational climate. On the positive side, it increases satisfaction with compensation. It reduces uncertainty among employees regarding the fairness of their own pay. It helps employees feel better about the place that they work at. Now, the evidence on jealousy, envy, dissatisfaction, remember that fear that people who prefer pay confidentiality have, that it will cause envy if you make things transparent. We actually do not find very strong evidence about tension among employees when there is pay transparency. The reality is there is some dissatisfaction with pay, but it's not for everyone. The dissatisfaction occurs only among employees who are paid low wages relative to their peers. And that's particularly true if there's not a clear compensation system so that the employee can understand why their pay would be different. Finally, it should be noted that employers are not the only ones who are sometimes skeptical about having salaries be transparent. Employees prefer to have confidentiality about their pay in two different categories. Those who are highly paid prefer to have confidentiality because they do not want a large pay gap to be apparent. Those who are lower wage employees prefer confidentiality because they want to avoid embarrassment about their low salaries. Now, the final workplace impact might be the most important one. What is the impact on the gender wage gap? Notably, pay transparency policy do foster a modest narrowing of the gender wage gap. This is driven by an increase in wages for women, along with a slowing of the growth of men's wages. Note that men's wages overall do not go down. Their growth curve slows down, and the growth curve for men and women, which previously had gone like this, becomes closer together. These gains are particularly true or higher for newly hired employees and for college-educated women. It's one of the great ironies of the workplace. The college-educated women have a large pay gap that tends to grow as time passes. Also, we should note that in places where sectors of the economy where salaries have been transparent for a long time, for example, among union employees and among the public sector, we see much greater gender and racial wage equity. So I'll turn back over to Travis now. Travis?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sally. So states and local jurisdictions have passed a wide variety of laws and ordinances about pay equity and pay transparency. These range from a rather straightforward extension of the Federal Equal Pay Act of 1963 to bans on asking about salary history to requiring annual reporting of salaries and wages broken down by gender and race. We provide here an overview of the many ways that a state or local government might approach increasing pay equity and pay transparency for employees. In our full report, we offer several case study examples from various states that have adopted these laws. There are other possibilities for pay transparencies that exist at the level of the individual employer. For example, a given company may decide to make all salaries transparent to all employees. Whole Foods, Sumall, and Buffer are three notable examples of corporations that have instituted high levels of pay transparency. Their CEOs note many benefits, including greater solidarity among teams, clarifying the pathway for promotions and raises, and compelling managers to provide detailed explanations for pay differentials. There are a couple of other points to consider in determining when and where pay transparency works well within a company. Group performance suffers when pay differences or similarities are not justified by individuals' performance. High dispersion of salaries is not necessarily bad, but rather it's the mismatch between pay and individual performance that creates problems. Also, transparency works best when an organization has formal evaluation systems, pay grades, and job classifications. That is, when performance is highly transparent and differences in levels of performance are easily recognized. Although there are several arguments against pay transparency, the evidence that we've presented here suggests that increased pay transparency has an overall positive impact on workers, as well as employers and organizations. This is especially true if pay transparency is implemented alongside clear performance measurements and employee communications about how pay is determined. There are options for interventions at both employer and governmental level to begin working towards increased pay transparency. Again, in our full report, we provide several different resources and examples. I'd now like to introduce Jane Keller, the Senior Director of Finance and Talent at Artworks, an award-winning Greater Cincinnati nonprofit that creates community-based public art and collaborates with community organizations and residents, businesses, governments, foundations, and nonprofits. Jane, thank you for joining us today and sharing about Artworks' pay transparency journey, and I'll let you take it from here.
There we go. I need to turn my speaker back on. It has been, I think I want to start with just a journey for Artworks of how we started on this path. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the kinds of pay transparency policies we've had to date. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how our journey started, how long it's been, the effect of these policies, what's the reaction been from employees, and then a little bit of recommendations based on our learnings, some of the places where we stubbed our toes a little bit. But I want to start with the fact that this is a journey. And ours started actually with an employee asking if we could post our salary ranges on our job postings. with the hope that our candidates could look at those salary ranges and know whether the role and the range of compensation was a good fit for them. And that was about 8 months prior to us actually implementing any pay transparency practices. And the reason being for the 8-month lag is that we had work to do, specifically around our salary ranges and market analysis and so forth that I'll talk about. So we started this journey because we believed in the value of transparency with our staff. And compensation had always been perceived as a secret and unknown, something not to be discussed openly, perceived as subjective. And that all contribute to the perception of possible unfairness or inequity amongst our staff. So we really didn't want to continue that misunderstanding going forward. So we rolled up our sleeves and decided to put an action plan together in order to address that. So to date, we've implemented several components of a pay transparency policy. We have more to do in our action plan going forward. So we've implemented pay ranges, postings to our job descriptions. We've evaluated our pay ranges by role with an ongoing practice to do that every 2 years with market analysis that is data informed. We've created a pay compensation philosophy with a standardized operating process. Both of those are accessible to all staff. We actually rolled those out in person with staff, talked about it, and then had a Q&A session. And then we have online accessibility for all staff if they want to go back and look at any of the particular things about our compensation philosophy. We provided preliminary trainings with managers on pay compensation analysis and the methodology that we used. We have a lot more here to do on that one. We also provided managers for the first time with information around their teams, with their direct reports, their compensation ranges for each of the individuals, with their salary history. And then we supported that with coaching on the specifics around that. We also sent out annual compensation statements to all staff that included their specific salary and, in addition to that, benefits. So we started the work in the summer of 2021 and been checking off our steps as we go forward. Got more to do going forward, and I suspect it will be a continuous improvement area for us that won't ever necessarily stop. So the first step that we started with our policies was to do research to establish our pay ranges by jobs, and then to evaluate individuals by role within those pay ranges for appropriateness based on their experience, their tenure, their training, their education, and performance. And then we reviewed that approach with our board committee. We have a talent and leadership committee with a lot of experience on that. And so as we went forward with each of our steps, we made sure that we've got input and oversight by our governance committee as well. And that was really important for us because they speak on the behalf of our compensation policies to the board. So that process resulted in some significant adjustments across staff, anywhere from 3% to 28% plus. So you have to be ready for that. And that, again, was one of the reasons that we had the committee spending time with us, the oversight, because we know that was going to be a significant investment from a budget perspective. And had far outpaced anything that we had done with salary investment in the past. In hindsight, our first step really should have been creating a pay compensation philosophy, and then the process behind it, how we were going to execute it. We did things a little bit backwards. We did the research, we made some adjustments, and then we created our pay compensation philosophy. If we do that over, I would start with compensation pay philosophy first. So we actually were making progress forward, and then we participated in the Eloquent program that really furthered our work, and it was really furthering the work around the policy perspective. So for instance, part of the program is that we did a staff survey, and then we did some listening sessions around pay compensation, and learn more from our staff on what they perceived or felt. So for example, 60% of our employees said they believe or they felt that they understood how pay was determined. And the same percentage said that they believed or they felt pay was fair when compared to other roles at Artworks. We disaggregated that information for the data for BIPOC and for LGBTQ+, and we found the percentages were fairly similar. There was no significant difference around that. So from that survey, and then actually listening to staff and their input of what they wanted to know more about and how, we're going to be spending more time with manager training first and foremost, because we're putting a lot of ownership on their shoulders with support by HR, myself, and others around compensation. So we want to make sure that they feel very comfortable about the methodology, around the approach. We've created some FAQs for them as well. So when they are having salary conversations with their team, they feel comfortable with those salary conversations. Of course, I'm always available in those conversations to support them or to ask or to answer any questions. Additionally, what we're going to be doing is also publicly announcing our support of pay equity, and we'll be signing on with the Hamilton County's Pay Equity Pledge very soon here. And we've also spent a fair amount of time of looking at our pay for performance, of how we're going to do it in a way that mitigates any unconscious bias, having some rubrics attached to it. We've rolled that out to all staff and done some in-depth training with our managers around that. And so this is while we've had pay for performance, I would say this is our first year to step in with an approach that we hope is objective and eliminates some of that subjectivity. We'll be watching for that salary compression that Sally was talking about, because this is the first time as managers this year that they'll be doing this type of work and providing their input around it. The effect of the work today has been a willingness by staff to ask questions about their pay and their pay range, and we see that as positive. There are situations, there have been, where a staff person still feels that their pay is not enough, but they do say that they have a better understanding of Artworks' approach. I have a particular example of why the work that we did was really important. An individual staff person came to me and indicated that they felt that where they were within their range was not appropriate for or valued what they brought to the organization. And this person had been with the organization for a few years. And as we dug into it and spent some time with the individual, the initial offer or salary for that individual had not taken into consideration many things, such as their prior experience, their training, their education. And so as a result of that conversation, we actually did go back and look at that individual's pay and where they were in the range and made some adjustment around that. And I just really value those conversations. It showcases that we have some opportunity still after all the work that we do, to catch some things that we didn't catch initially when we went back and did salary adjustments. And I think it also provides the value of open conversation within the organizations. Some other individuals, we've had those conversations with, we've walked through why they are within their range. They still might not agree, but at least they have an understanding now of the approach and methodology that Artworks takes. I'd mentioned that there's a deeper understanding by our managers, and they have an increased comfort level to have those conversations with their team members. We still have work to do around that. As new supervisors are brought on into the organization, we also have an onboarding now that gives them the tools for them, if they've not had those experience in their past manager roles, in order to understand the methodology that Artworks uses for their pay compensation and pay for performance. So I think for us, there's been a lot of positives around it. And as I mentioned, we value transparency within the organization. And so unmasking that secrecy around pay has been a good thing for the organization. A couple recommendations are from learnings that we've had, as I mentioned before, is start with an action plan. And an action plan that takes you from the beginning to the end with timelines. It's going to hold the organization accountable and update that progress with the staff. Share openly around your action plan, your timelines, and then share as well the progress they're making against that. I think your actions will speak louder than just the words on a piece of paper. As I mentioned before, we did not start with drafting a compensation philosophy and statement. My suggestion would start there. I really think then it gives you time to have an outlined discussion, reflect on what your philosophy is, put it on a piece of paper, make sure that it's clear, and then you have an opportunity to involve your governance, whatever that might look like for your organization, for their support and their insights. And it just starts you, I think, in a great position before you actually start doing the work that's going to support that compensation philosophy. And then I would say create good process so you can execute successfully against your philosophy. Involve your staff. It was really important, the listening sessions and the survey that we did with staff as part of the Eloquent program. It reinforced some of the policy work that we saw as we assessed our policies and the gaps. It just reinforced that and helped us create our future action steps. They're in an action plan for the next year plus, and that the staff are aware of, and that we give progress updates around that. For an example, one of the areas that we do not have good policy within the organization is around our promotion policy. And so we're going to tackle that with input from staff, create a promotion policy. So staff have a good understanding, again, of how promotions are done and how compensation is supported with those, or those promotions are supported with compensation philosophy. And then the last slide would say it's hard work. So just know it's going to be hard work. But know that as you move forward, you're going to probably stub your toes along the way. We surely did. But do not let perfect get in the way of good work that needs to be done within the organization. And then my last thing I would say is make sure your job descriptions are really accurate before you start analyzing market data to determine your pay ranges. You want to make sure that the responsibilities within those job descriptions are accurate. That's something that we involved staff of spending time of looking at their job descriptions with their managers and making sure if there had been changes or if there weren't responsibilities on those job descriptions, that we amended those job descriptions accordingly. And that's a practice that we'll look on a yearly basis of looking at our job descriptions and make sure that they're in good order. So we make sure as we review our salary ranges for those jobs that we have all the accurate information. So that's a little bit about what Artworks has done. We look forward to the work we still have to 2 years to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was wonderful. We appreciate you sharing your insights and your experience at Artworks. It's always so helpful to hear what's actually happening within an employer. I'm Holly Hankinson. I'm the Advocacy Director of the Women's Fund, and I'm excited to welcome into the conversation founder and president of OPC Consulting, Arlene Koth. She is going to share her insights with us on this issue as an expert in the field. So before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit about Arlene. She has over 2 decades of human resource management and organizational planning experience, nearly 20 years of nonprofit experience, and 15 years of C-suite and executive leadership experience. She founded OPC Consulting to turn her passion for inclusion, justice, and equity into a full-time career. Arlene has lived the experiences she works with others to overcome. Instead of hiding her difficult personal challenges, she combines them with her decades of professional experience and expertise to create practical and sustainable changes inside organizations that want to improve how they function. Arlene received her BA in Communications from the Union Institute and University and is certified as a senior professional in human resources. She's a graduate of Leadership Cincinnati, the We Lead program, and the African American Leadership Development Program. And she's been recognized as a Business Career 40 Under 40 award recipient, as a Rising Star of the YWCA, and as a We Celebrate Mentor of the Year finalist. She's also served on the board of the YWCA, Cincinnati Works, the Over the Rhine Chamber of Commerce, and the Good Samaritan Hospital Foundation, as well as board chair of the African American Chamber of Commerce, secretary of the DCI Board of Directors, and as co-chair of LAD's Over the Rhine International Film Festival. We are so thankful to have you here with us today, Arlene. So I'm just going to start with the question, sort of a general question. Can you please tell us how common is pay transparency with the companies you work with? And do they sort of have and communicate a compensation philosophy to their employees?
So first, thank you so much, Holly, and the rest of the Women's Fund for having me today. And to answer that question, I would say that there hasn't been a single organization that I've worked with that has had pay transparency, especially not to the level that we're discussing today. And there is generally not a philosophy. And if it is, it's not something that's been documented and communicated widely within the organization. What usually happens is that organizations have job descriptions. They do an initial study sometimes, and they decide what those job descriptions are worth, and then that's what they do for the rest of the time that they are in existence. There's not a lot of intentionality about keeping those things up to date. What I often see is, oh my gosh, we're having trouble hiring at this particular level, let's raise the salary, without a thought around compensation compression, which Travis and Sally both talked about, and which is also in the report. And so it has not been something that's been very common.
Great, thank you. It sounds like we have a ways to go here. Sort of in that vein, what is your advice to companies on increasing pay transparency, and sort of what is their reaction to when you bring this up with them?
Well, if I had known Jane before today, I would have told them all to give Jane a call, because their journey is clearly a really great case study in how you can do this. But what I do tell them now, of course, now that I do know Jane, that's what I'm going to tell them. But before Jane, I would always just say, you know, a lot of the things that Jane said. First of all, make sure that what you're doing is equitable. We have to start there. So I always have them start at the very beginning. Look at your roles and your job descriptions, because oftentimes those job descriptions were written in 1982, and they have been tweaked here and there, maybe back in 92, and then they've just kind of gone with the way things are, and they haven't been changed. So it's hard to start creating compensation, transparency, and equity when you don't even have equitable and up-to-date job descriptions. And then the other part is, and this, I don't want to pick on nonprofits, because I love nonprofits and they are a big part of my business, but nonprofits often create jobs around people that they like versus creating the job that the organization needs. And I don't mean to say that it's all about the organization and not about the people, but there is usually an imbalance. So for instance, you might have somebody that you really like, they're a great person, they're not really cut out for the job that you hired them to do or where the organization is moving. And therefore we create a job description for that person. And then we create inequities and inefficiencies by having to create workarounds around this person, or by giving people parts of this person's job so that you can keep them on. And so then that continues to create those inequities in compensation. So in order to really start doing the transparency piece and the equity piece, you have to start with making sure that the roles are clear, they're up to date based on what the organization needs, and then figure out where your talent fits in there. And then once you do that, you can actually go and do some of the market research that Jane was talking about to figure out, where are you? And every organization is going to have different budgetary restrictions. So comparing yourself to, and these are other things too, comparing yourself to people in your industry alone is not a good way to start getting that compensation straight. Why? Because you could be in an industry that is historically and continues to be maybe a industry that underpays people. And so now you're comparing yourself to that industry. And so you get to be the best of the worst. That's not where we want to go. So you want to make those comparisons on who your competition is. Who are the people that would be hiring the same people doing the same type of work, and then go from there. But there's a lot of steps along the way, and it's not just, it's much more complex. And I don't think most people understand how complex compensation strategy can be. And so just first of all, understand that it is complex. And as Jane talked about, it does take time. It's not something that you're going to fix in 6 months. It's usually going to be over the course of years. And if you've got those pay discrepancies, you have to start working on what's the strategy, because for some organizations, fixing everything all at once is just not feasible. How do we get people where they should be over the course of time, and how do we communicate that out? So those are all very important steps to really getting towards that pay compensation. I don't know if I answered your question because I started rambling a bit, so I apologize.
No, that was great. No, I think that's awesome. And I think, you know, as you're having these conversations with employers and you're sort of introducing this concept to them, you know, I noticed, you know, you said that there aren't a lot that are sort of already there, but the ones that are open to the idea of increasing transparency, what barriers are they facing commonly in instituting this in their organizations?
So what the biggest barrier is that some of these folks don't have dedicated HR professionals. So that means that somebody else who's doing another job is trying to do this as well. And this is a lot of work. And it is a lot of complex analysis. And I don't mean like it's too complex for anybody, but it's not something that you just quickly do, you know, in your spare time. You've got to dedicate time and energy to really looking at it. And, you know, I keep going back to some of the things that Jane has talked about in their journey. Is there's time that it takes to talk to employees, to find out exactly what they're doing, because the job descriptions mean something, find out how they're feeling about their pay. All of those things take time. And so that's one of the barriers. If you don't have somebody dedicated and you don't make it a priority, it's almost impossible for it to get done. The other thing is that there are organizations who maybe know intuitively that they've got some disparities across either roles and departments, across gender, across race, across any of those things that intersect. So, you know, when we talk about gender and race on top of each other, you've got even bigger disparities. And so they're not sure how to even address that. And so they feel like maybe it's like teeth. If they ignore it, they'll just go away. But they don't. So you want to just make sure that you're ready to have those conversations to say, we recognize that we've got these disparities. And a lot of organizations are not necessarily ready to do that, or it feels way too daunting. And so some of those discrepancies, as mentioned in the report, come from those who are highly compensated and those who are on the lower end or the entry level end of the work. And so now we don't want that out there, because that creates all of these perceived and sometimes real problems within the organization. So not having a good strategy in place on how they will actually maybe take small steps to get there versus today we don't have any transparency and next month we want to have full transparency. There are some ways to do that in between, and that's also stated in the report. So I think that the barrier is people just don't know where to start and they're afraid. The fear is the biggest barrier, quite frankly.
Yeah, I totally can see that. So when you're thinking about employer pay sort of as well in general, do you see a difference in how employers are approaching pay for sort of that internal movement, sort of promotions, raises with existing employees versus new hires?
I have seen a lot of this done in a way that's not really fair and equitable. What I see oftentimes is somebody who's already in the job will be getting paid less than somebody that they bring into the same job. And so let's say that I've been with this organization for 4 or 5 years. I just got promoted to the next level. And because I was already there, my pay my pay increase is minimal because they're like, well, we can't give you a 25% increase, but we're going to hire this new person into this same job we just promoted you into, and they're going to get the pay that goes with this job. But because you were already there, oftentimes there's this bias of the person that's already there. And I don't know, I'm going to age myself a bit, but I remember back when, cell phone companies were first getting started and they would say, if you're a new customer, you get this great perk. And they completely forgot about the customers who had been with them for however long. I don't know if they still do that anymore. None of it makes sense to me, but that's the same thing that often happens inside of organizations when it comes to compensation, is if you do not have a clear promotional process that fits with your compensation philosophy and model, you're going to then end up creating these disparities inside of the organization when you make those internal movements. So if I'm in one range and I get bumped up to the next range, I should be getting paid for that next range, not, oh, well, you've been here, we can only give you 15%. If the next range is 22%, then that person should be getting 22%. And so a lot of organizations are not necessarily following that, at least not consistently.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pause for a second. I have a couple more questions for you, but I want to make sure we save time for our audience to ask questions. So please, if you have a question for either Arlene or Jane or our researchers, pop those in the chat right now, and then we'll go through in a couple of minutes and sort of see if we can get those addressed as well. So actually another question for you, Arlene, while we're waiting for questions from the chat is what is the impact of pay transparency that you're seeing on employees and workplace culture?
So when people know how money is decided, they feel better and you have easier conversations about money. We have been conditioned, I think, to not talk about it. I think it even in the research, it says that there's this conditional or both informal in the way that we've always done it. We don't talk about it. But when you open up that pay transparency to whatever level increment you need to be at as you're on your journey, people are definitely more positive about talking about it. It makes it easier for you to, Jane said it very well, to start thinking about mitigate those biases that occur that cause some of those pay discrepancies. Because, I really like Travis a lot. Therefore, when it's time for his increase, I'm going to give him a little bit more. But, Sam over here is kind of, I don't really like him all that much, but they're both doing a good job. If I know how pay is done, I can ask questions about it. And that way I know that I'm not being mistreated or that I'm not being treated inequitably. And then it also allows the organization to continue on its journey to continue to work towards creating that equity, which then takes some of that fear out of the pay transparency, because a lot of that fear comes with the fact that there are those inequities, and now how do I talk about them? So once we start opening that up and we're clear about how we're doing it, it makes it easier to communicate that within the organization, and employees are actually pretty grateful for it.
Great. I have one more question for you, and then maybe we'll check out the chat. What advice do you have for employees who might want to have a conversation with their employers around pay transparency?
That is so tricky. And as a recovering HR practitioner, I don't envy Jane in having to deal with these things every day, or even some of the folks on this webinar who are currently practicing, because those are tough conversations to have. But I think that if you're an employee and you want to talk to your employer, I think that being able to have, one, the data that you all have put together in this latest report is going to be extremely helpful, because then it's not feeling like it's coming from an emotional place, or that it's coming from a me place, even though there's nothing wrong with being worried about yourself. But when you can present some of those things that you're concerned about in an objective way with some empirical research around it, it just makes it easier to have those conversations. So if you have access to somebody in HR, just sitting down and saying, hey, you know, I've got this information, I found out about this, and I really would love for us to be able to have a discussion about, is there a way that we can start our journey? I don't think that going at it saying you guys are doing it wrong is the best way to approach those conversations, but to approach it in a way of how can we start our journey? If you are an HR professional and an employee who wants to have this conversation, I would say whoever the highest ranking person is that you have a good relationship with in the organization, sit down and have a similar conversation, and even think through how you might plan the work, because it is work and it will take some time.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you. It's been wonderful chatting with you today. I am going to turn it back over to Alicia, because I think she has some questions for our members of our panelists, speakers today, experts.
Yes. So the first question came up when Jane was speaking, so I do think it's for Jane. Do you have a formula how to take prior experience, education, and tenure into salary decisions?
I do not have a formula, and there's certain areas that we would like to improve on. So I have some information as far what we look at is if somebody is coming into a role fresh out of some post-secondary or experience related of where they should be within the pay range. We looked at data within the organization based on where individuals were based on experience and their education and their performance and so forth, and use that. But I did not have a particular formula. But Arlene might be able to help us there.
Thanks, Jane. I don't have a formula that you can put into an Excel spreadsheet. The one thing that I suggest to my clients is when you sit down, and I keep going back to this job description, when you sit down and you say that this is what I need in this job, I have them start with three things. One, if I was walking into this job fresh and I have never done it before, what are the things that I absolutely have to have from an experience standpoint? If I was midway in this job, what experience would I need? And if I'm at the top of this job and I've been here for a while, what experience would I need? And that way you start to create a spectrum that you can use to understand where people's experience is. Because somebody is new to your organization doesn't mean that they're new to the role. And so considering if you know kind of along that spectrum inside the role, what that looks like, you're going to do a better job. But I don't think that there's a definitive formula, because experience is fluid sometimes. And so I think just understanding kind of those parameters will help.
Thank you so much. That was great. I have another question. It popped up during Jane's presentation. It said, could you share what data you used for the initial research?
So initially what we used is the Leadership Council nonprofit survey. And with that mapped over based on the descriptions and the responsibilities, our roles to those that were categorized within the survey. That survey particularly is helpful because it segments data. It's all nonprofit data, but it segments it based on location, by budget size, employee size, and sector within the nonprofit. There were some of our roles that just did not map over. And so for those roles, I went externally of looking across different places for salary to come up with what we thought a salary range would be appropriate. And then by looking at the underlying responsibilities. But what I would say is, as I mentioned, we're doing this every 2 years. So this year we're going to go deeper. We're going to spend more time at looking at market data. I think some of the things that Arlene has talked about is really making sure that you aren't just comparing yourselves with the same type of organization, feel good with it. So that's an area we're going to improve on this year, but that was the initial data that we used, mostly from the Leadership Nonprofit Council. I think there's like 140 organizations that participate in that survey, covering maybe 6,000 or 7,000 employees. And they provide the compensation by quartiles as well. Of the 25, the midpoint, the 75, they have some weighted averages. So it was a good starting point for us.
Thank you, Jane. This question is for anyone. Is there a gender factor in the statistics on implementing pay transparency?
I'll take that one. I asked the person who asked the question to clarify a little bit, and what she's interested in is in a male-dominated career in particular, such as in manufacturing, does pay transparency help with the acceptance of women who are coming into that labor force? I'm not aware of any specific studies of that. I do know that in the manufacturing sector, when things are unionized, you do move towards much greater racial and gender pay equity. However, in other sectors, for example, that might be male dominated, I think of computer science or computer programming as a very male dominated sector. You don't necessarily have that kind of pay transparency in those professional roles. Do any other panelists have anything else to add?
I was going to say that I was in construction, which is a male-dominated industry, and there's the pay transparency isn't good in that industry. That industry is kind of always a few steps behind everybody else in adopting new ways of being. But what we did where I was working was make it very clear that if we're going to be an inclusive organization, we have to be very clear that this is not part of what we do. If you are, it does, for instance, we went over doing some equity work on the compensation in one of our divisions. And this division had basically one woman and I think like 20 men. And we went through and we did all the work that Jane talked about, where we talked to everybody about what the roles were, what success looked like. We came up with the pay ranges. Everybody was cool with it. Then when we went back and looked at where everybody was, and we needed to make a change because the woman in that group was underpaid, one of them came back and said, well, she can't do such and such. And I said, well, you didn't say that was part of this. And you've got another person who also can't do that, but look how much they're making. So there's not necessarily a formula, I don't think, for it, or as Sally was saying, not necessarily the statistics, but it is key to being able to get and retain women in these fields that are male dominated. So somebody has to be intentional about it.
Thank you. And I think that answered one of our other questions. And there is one more question that we don't have time for. So I would just ask the panelists if you could please provide some well-regarded sources for market research, if you could drop that information in the chat if you know of anything. And I want to definitely thank each of you for being here today. This was a really productive and fruitful conversation, and I personally learned a ton. I do have a couple of announcements. So we're going to be continuing pay transparency and pay equity work later this spring. We'll be in partnership with the Hamilton County Commission of Women and Girls and Eloquate, sponsored by the Duke Energy Foundation. We will be co-hosting a pay equity learning series titled The Pathway to Parity. So if you have more learnings that you're interested, especially if you're an employer, you can attend that. And tomorrow we will be serving as a host for the Hamilton County Pay Equity Commitment Signing Day. We're looking forward to welcoming the county commissioners, Commission on Women and Girls, and employees committed to taking this step toward pay equity in our community. A huge thank you to Commissioner Driehaus, the Commission on Women and Girls, and their leader, Mary Mowney, for their leadership on this issue. That will be tomorrow at the Greater Cincinnati Foundation at 3:30, yes. And so thank you all so much for attending, and I hope everyone goes on to have a productive afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.